I acted poor and naive when I met my daughter-in-law's family. I wore my oldest coat, kept my voice soft, and let my eyes stay low, because I wanted them to believe I was exactly what they expected. While they were judging my shoes and my silence, they had no idea who I really was, or what would happen once I understood their true intentions. That night, I learned something important. People reveal their character fastest when they think they are superior. My name is Margaret Lewis, and I am 62 years old. I live quietly now, alone in a modest home, with mornings that begin slowly and evenings that end early. People who see me today would never imagine the life I once lived, the decisions I once made, or the power I once held. And that is precisely why I learned long ago that sometimes the safest place to be is underestimated. My son Daniel is my only child. I raised him after his father died suddenly when Daniel was still young, and those years carved something gentle into him. He grew into a kind man, thoughtful and patient, the kind who assumes honesty until proven otherwise. When he told me he was engaged, I saw happiness in his eyes, but I also noticed something else, a quiet tension he didn't know how to name. Emily, his fiancée, was polite and warm the first time I met her. She spoke with respect and looked people in the eye, but there was nervousness behind her smile. She loved my son deeply, that much was clear. Yet, whenever her family was mentioned, her shoulders stiffened slightly, as if she had learned to brace herself long ago. When Daniel told me her family wanted to meet me for dinner, I agreed without hesitation. But that night, alone in my house, I thought carefully about what kind of woman they were expecting to see. Wealthy families often measure worth before character, and something in Daniel's voice told me they would be doing just that. By morning, I had made my decision. I would not impress them. I would observe them. On the evening of the dinner, I chose plain clothes and simple shoes, nothing torn or unclean, just unremarkable. I left my jewelry at home and wore no watch. I practiced a gentle smile in the mirror, the kind people associate with someone who has lived a small life. Then I reminded myself to listen more than I spoke. Their house was large and polished, designed to be admired rather than lived in. Emily's mother opened the door, and though she smiled, her eyes flicked quickly over my clothes before settling somewhere behind me, as if expecting someone else. Her father shook my hand briefly, already turning his attention back to Daniel. Within minutes, they began asking questions that sounded polite, but carried sharp edges. Where I lived, whether I was alone, if I still worked. Each answer I gave was true, yet carefully incomplete. As dinner continued, the room filled with stories about investments, connections, and expectations. No one asked about my past, my thoughts, or my experiences. I was present, yet invisible. At one point, Emily's mother leaned toward her daughter and whispered that I seemed sweet and humble, a phrase often used when people decide you are harmless. Then Emily's father spoke about stability, about lifestyle, about what marriage should look like. He directed his words at Daniel, not at me, making it clear who he believed carried value at the table. When he finally looked in my direction, it was with the quiet assumption that I would understand my place, that I would accept whatever boundaries they chose to draw around their son's future. I nodded gently and said nothing, because by then I understood exactly who they were. They saw a quiet old woman with modest clothes and assumed there was nothing behind her eyes. They did not know the rooms I had once sat in, the authority I once carried, or the fact that silence can be a choice rather than a weakness. When the dinner ended and we drove home, Daniel apologized for their behavior, his voice filled with embarrassment and concern. I looked out the window and told him not to worry, because they had behaved exactly as I expected. Inside, however, I was already thinking ahead. Because once people reveal how they truly think, you gain something far more valuable than approval. You gain leverage, and that was only the beginning. After that dinner, I told myself I would stay quiet and simply watch, but life has a way of testing even the most patient people. Over the next few weeks, Emily's family began inserting themselves into Daniel and Emily's wedding plans with a confidence that bordered on ownership. Every suggestion came wrapped in concern, every opinion disguised as wisdom. Yet beneath it all was a clear message. They believed their way was the only way. And they believed I would not interfere. Emily called me one afternoon, her voice hesitant, asking if we could talk. When she arrived at my house, she sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She spoke about her parents' expectations, about venues and guest lists, about how they wanted to keep things appropriate, given my situation. She tried to sound calm, but the hurt slipped through when she admitted her mother had suggested I not invite too many people, since I likely didn't have many connections. I smiled gently and told her not to worry. That weddings were stressful and families often overstepped. I could see relief wash over her face, and that alone told me how heavy the pressure had been. But when she left, I sat quietly for a long time because I knew then that their behavior wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, practiced, and rooted in something far uglier than concern. Soon after, Emily's parents invited Daniel and me to lunch, just the three of us. They framed it as a chance to bond, but the conversation quickly revealed its true purpose. Emily's father spoke about financial responsibility and suggested that, given my modest lifestyle, it might be best if they handle certain wedding expenses directly. He said it kindly, as if doing me a favor, but his eyes carried certainty, the certainty of a man who assumed I had nothing to contribute. When he mentioned a prenuptial agreement, carefully emphasizing how it would protect everyone involved, I noticed how naturally the words came to him. This wasn't a new idea. It was something they had discussed long before I ever sat at that table. They spoke as if my son's future was a transaction to be managed, not a life to be respected. I asked a few soft questions, playing my role well. I nodded, I thanked them for their generosity, and I let them believe they had successfully guided me into agreement. But inside, my thoughts were already several steps ahead. People like them often underestimate the danger of assuming silence means consent. What they didn't realize was that I had spent years navigating rooms filled with people just like them, confident, polished, convinced of their superiority. I had learned how to listen for what wasn't being said, how to recognize when kindness was merely a mask. And I knew this situation would eventually force me to choose between remaining invisible and protecting my son. The turning point came unexpectedly. On an afternoon I wasn't supposed to be there. I had gone to Emily's parents' house early to drop off some documents they'd asked Daniel to collect later. When I arrived, the house was quiet, and believing no one was home, I let myself in with the spare key Emily had given me. As I moved toward the study, I heard voices, low, serious, and unmistakably tense. I stopped, instinctively stepping back into the shadow of the hallway, because I recognized Emily's mother's tone immediately. She was speaking freely, without politeness, without restraint. She talked about appearances, about how people like me didn't understand their world. She said it would be best if Daniel relied on their guidance. because his mother has lived a very small life. Then Emily's father laughed softly and said something that made my hands tremble. He said that once the marriage was finalized, boundaries would be easier to enforce. That influence could be managed. That loyalty could be redirected. He spoke as though my son was an asset to be secured, not a man with his own heart and history. I stayed perfectly still, my breathing slow and silent. As they continued discussing plans that involved decisions made without my son's knowledge, they assumed I was weak. They assumed I was irrelevant. And in doing so, they revealed everything I needed to know. When I finally stepped back outside, the afternoon air felt heavy, as if the truth itself had weight. I drove home without turning on the radio, replaying their words again and again, not with anger, but with clarity. Because now the situation was no longer about pride or dignity. It was about protecting my son from people who believed control was love. That evening, Daniel came by my house. He spoke excitedly about the wedding, unaware of the storm quietly forming around him. I listened, smiled, and made him tea, because I knew that rushing the truth would only push him further into confusion. Instead, I told him how proud I was of the man he'd become, how much I trusted his judgment. And when he left, I made a decision I had hoped I'd never need to make. The next time Emily's family underestimated me, it would be the last time. Because once you stop pretending to be powerless, people like them have nothing to stand on, and they were about to find out exactly who I really was. After that day, I stopped seeing Emily's parents as simply difficult people and began seeing them for what they truly were, strategists. They planned conversations the way others planned investments, always thinking several steps ahead, always assuming everyone else was too distracted or too small to notice. And they still believed I was neither a threat nor a variable. That belief became their greatest mistake. I didn't confront them right away. Instead, I did what I had always done best. I observed. I listened carefully to the way Emily spoke about her parents when she felt safe, and to the way Daniel defended them when he felt uncertain. I noticed how Emily flinched whenever money was mentioned, and how Daniel tried to smooth over tension with optimism rather than truth. Love made him hopeful. Experience had made me cautious. Emily came to see me more often after that. Sometimes she helped in the kitchen. Sometimes she just sat with me, talking about small things, as if the quiet itself was a relief. One afternoon, as we folded laundry together, she finally said what she'd been holding back. She admitted her parents had always measured people by what they could provide, not who they were. She said she loved them, but she had learned early that affection in her family often came with conditions, told her gently that love should never feel like a negotiation. She looked at me then, really looked at me, as if trying to understand how a woman like me could speak with such certainty. I could tell she wanted to ask questions, but she wasn't ready yet. Truth has a way of finding people when they are strong enough to carry it. The first crack in her parents' confidence appeared during a planning meeting they hosted at their house. They had invited a wedding consultant, a lawyer, and several relatives, framing it as an organized discussion. Daniel and Emily sat beside each other, smiling politely, while I took my seat quietly at the far end of the table. Once again, no one asked for my input. They spoke over me, around me, and past me, assuming I would remain agreeable and silent. The lawyer began explaining financial arrangements in precise, practiced language, emphasizing protections, safeguards, and expectations. Emily's parents nodded approvingly. Daniel listened carefully, but I noticed the tension in his jaw. When the lawyer asked if there were any questions, the room fell quiet. Everyone waited for Daniel to speak. Instead, I lifted my eyes and asked one simple question. I asked how much transparency there would be in these arrangements, and whether all parties involved had equal access to the information. The lawyer paused, slightly surprised, before answering in a way that avoided specifics. I followed with another question, calmly pointing out a potential conflict in the structure he described. This time the room shifted. Emily's father looked at me more closely, as if noticing me for the first time. The consultant tried to move the discussion along, but the rhythm had been broken. Emily's mother smiled tightly and said she admired my interest, though her tone suggested she hadn't expected it. I nodded and said I believed clarity prevented resentment, a statement so mild it couldn't be challenged, yet strong enough to linger. After that meeting, Daniel asked me privately if I had studied law. I laughed softly and told him no, but that I had learned a great deal about contracts over the years. He looked at me with curiosity, a hint of something new forming behind his eyes. It was the first moment he realized there might be more to my quiet life than he had assumed. Emily noticed it too. She grew more attentive, more thoughtful, watching how her parents reacted to me with subtle discomfort. They had lost the ease they once had around me, the careless confidence that comes from believing someone is insignificant. Now they were careful with their words, measured in their smiles. The real shift happened during a family dinner meant to restore harmony. Emily's father raised a toast about unity and respect, speaking loudly and warmly. But when he mentioned shared values, I responded by speaking about integrity and mutual trust. I told a short story about a time when I had trusted the wrong people and learned the cost of overlooking red flags. I kept it vague, impersonal, but the message landed exactly where it needed to. Emily's mother excused herself early that evening. Daniel asked if he had said something wrong. I told him no, that truth often makes people uncomfortable when they are not used to being seen clearly. That night, Emily stayed behind after Daniel left. Her eyes filled with questions she could no longer ignore. She asked me who I really was. I didn't answer her fully. I told her that I was someone who loved her son deeply and would never allow him to be treated as less than he deserved. I told her that family should lift people up, not quietly position themselves above them. And I told her that if she ever felt torn between loyalty and self-respect, she didn't have to face that conflict alone. She cried then, quietly, the way people do when they finally feel understood. In that moment, I realized the story unfolding wasn't just about control or power. It was about breaking a cycle that had been repeating itself long before I ever entered their lives. Emily's parents, however, were not finished. They began pushing harder, tightening their grip with subtle pressure, scheduling meetings without including me, making suggestions that isolated Daniel from my influence, framing concern as urgency. But they were no longer dealing with a woman content to be invisible. They had awakened, someone they did not recognize. And soon, they would learn that underestimating the wrong person doesn't just change the conversation. It changes the outcome. The pressure finally became too heavy to ignore. Emily's parents stopped pretending to be subtle, and their concern turned into control so openly that even Daniel could no longer explain it away as misunderstanding. They began calling him daily, questioning his decisions, advising him against listening to people who didn't understand their world. I knew exactly who they meant. And this time, they wanted me to hear it directly. They invited me to their house again, framing it as a family discussion meant to clear the air. The invitation was polite, but the urgency beneath it was unmistakable. I accepted without hesitation, not because I wanted peace, but because I knew avoidance would only strengthen their confidence. When I arrived, Emily was already there, her posture tense, her eyes flicking toward me with quiet concern. Daniel sat beside her, calm on the surface, troubled beneath. Emily's father wasted no time. He spoke about boundaries, about influence, about how marriages worked best when outside voices didn't complicate things. His words were careful, but the message was sharp. Emily's mother nodded along, adding that they only wanted what was best, especially given my limited exposure to certain lifestyles. She said it kindly, as if explaining something to a child. I listened until they finished, then folded my hands and spoke slowly. I told them I appreciated their honesty and that it was refreshing when people finally said what they meant instead of hiding behind manners. That alone shifted the room. Emily's father frowned slightly, unaccustomed to being addressed without deference. I continued explaining that influence only becomes a problem when it replaces respect, and that love does not require management. Daniel looked at me then, surprised by the firmness in my voice. Emily's mother tried to redirect the conversation, but Emily spoke up before she could. For the first time, she told her parents how suffocated she had felt, how every decision in her life had been evaluated, approved, or corrected. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. She said she loved them, but she was tired of feeling like affection was conditional. The room fell silent. Emily's father responded with disappointment rather than apology, accusing her of being emotional and ungrateful. That was when something inside me hardened. I told him calmly that dismissing someone's truth didn't make it disappear, it only delayed the consequences. I saw irritation flash across his face. He asked me, directly this time, what authority I believed I had to interfere in their family matters. I smiled then, not out of amusement, but because the question revealed everything. I told him I wasn't interfering, I was protecting. Protecting my son, protecting Emily, and protecting the future they were trying to build without manipulation. I told him that power used quietly was still power, and control wrapped in kindness was still control. Emily's mother stood abruptly, saying this conversation was becoming disrespectful. I agreed. I said disrespect begins the moment someone assumes superiority without understanding the full picture. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply spoke with certainty. And certainty unsettles people who rely on dominance. Daniel finally spoke, asking his future in-laws why so many decisions had been discussed without him. He asked why transparency had been avoided. They tried to reassure him, but the confidence was gone. The dynamic had shifted. They were no longer guiding. They were defending. As the conversation unraveled, Emily's father made one final mistake. He said something about my background, implying that my lack of visible success limited my understanding of complex matters. That was the moment I decided to stop protecting their illusions. I told them, quietly, that there was a reason I didn't speak often about my past. Not because it was insignificant, but because it no longer defined me. I told them I had spent decades working in environments where decisions shaped lives, where contracts mattered, and where power was exercised carefully because mistakes were costly. I didn't give details. I didn't need to. The tone of my voice did the work for me. The room changed instantly. Emily's mother looked at me with new eyes. Emily's father leaned back, suddenly unsure. Daniel stared at me, stunned, realizing there were entire chapters of my life he had never asked about. I told them that underestimating people had consequences, and that assuming weakness based on appearance was one of the most expensive mistakes anyone could make. When we left that house, no one spoke for several minutes. Emily finally broke the silence, thanking me for standing up not just for Daniel but for her. Daniel asked me why I had never told him these things before. I told him that sometimes people need to see the truth themselves before they are ready to hear it. But the story was far from over. Because Emily's parents were not the kind of people who accepted loss quietly. And I knew with absolute certainty that their next move would be far more dangerous than words. The next few weeks were quiet on the surface, but beneath that calm, everything was shifting. Emily's parents stopped calling as often, stopped offering advice, stopped pretending to guide. Silence, in their case, wasn't peace, it was calculation. Daniel sensed it too. He became more reflective, asking questions about my past, about the choices I made after his father passed, about how I managed to raise him without ever leaning on anyone else. I answered honestly, but selectively, because the final truth wasn't something to be dropped casually. It deserved the right moment. That moment arrived sooner than I expected. Emily's parents requested one final meeting, insisting it was to clear misunderstandings and move forward as a family. They suggested a neutral location, a private room at a quiet restaurant, and emphasized how important reconciliation was to them. Emily was hesitant, but Daniel believed closure was necessary. I agreed, because I knew avoidance would only allow them to rewrite the narrative in their favor. When we arrived, they were already seated, composed and polite, wearing the calm expressions of people who believed they were still in control. The conversation began gently, almost rehearsed. Apologies were offered, though they were vague and carefully worded, more about intention than accountability. Emily's father spoke about stress and fear of losing his daughter. Emily's mother spoke about tradition and concern. They wanted understanding without consequences. Then Emily surprised everyone. She thanked them for acknowledging tension, but told them clearly that acknowledgement was not the same as change. She said she loved them, but she would no longer accept decisions being made about her life without her consent. Her voice didn't shake this time. Daniel reached for her hand, and in that simple gesture, I saw the future solidify. Emily's parents turned to me, perhaps hoping I would soften the moment. Instead, I did what I had come to do. I told them that before this family moved forward, there was something they needed to understand fully. I spoke calmly, without pride or bitterness, and explained who I had been before I chose a quieter life. I told them about the years I spent in senior management, negotiating contracts, overseeing acquisitions, and making decisions that affected thousands of employees. I told them about stepping away after my husband's death, not because I failed, but because I chose peace over prestige. I didn't mention numbers. I didn't need to. Experience carries its own weight. Their reactions were immediate and unmistakable. Emily's mother's composure cracked first, her eyes widening as realization settled in. Emily's father tried to recover, asking careful questions now, respectful ones, the kind he should have asked from the beginning. Daniel sat silently, absorbing the truth not with resentment, but with awe. He finally understood that my simplicity had always been a choice, not a limitation. Asterisk, I finished by saying that none of this mattered unless it changed how we treated one another. I told them that respect should never be based on status and that love should never be conditional. I made it clear that their involvement in Daniel and Emily's life was welcome only if it came without control, manipulation, or quiet superiority. Asterisk, for the first time, they listened without interrupting. Asterisk, the weeks that followed were different. Not perfect, but honest. Emily's parents stepped back, learning how to participate without directing. Boundaries were respected. Conversations became clearer. Daniel grew into his role as a partner rather than a son caught between loyalties. And Emily found a confidence that had been waiting patiently beneath years of expectation. Asterisk, on the day of the wedding, I watched my son stand beside the woman he loved, steady and certain. Emily's parents greeted me not with polite tolerance, but with genuine respect. It wasn't victory that filled me then. It was relief. Relief that truth, when handled with patience and courage, had done what force never could. Asterisk, people often mistake quiet for weakness and humility for ignorance. They assume that those who don't announce their strength don't possess it. But the most powerful people in the room are often the ones who wait, observe, and choose their moment carefully. I never needed them to know who I was. I only needed them to understand that love, when underestimated, can still stand its ground. Asterisk, and it always will. The next few weeks were quiet on the surface, but beneath that calm, everything was shifting. Emily's parents stopped calling as often, stopped offering advice, stopped pretending to guide. Silence, in their case, wasn't peace, it was calculation. Daniel sensed it too. He became more reflective, asking questions about my past, about the choices I'd made after his father passed, about how I'd managed to raise him without ever leaning on anyone else. I answered honestly, but selectively, because the final truth wasn't something to be dropped casually. It deserved the right moment. Asterisk, that moment arrived sooner than I expected. Emily's parents requested one final meeting, insisting it was to clear misunderstandings and move forward as a family. They suggested a neutral location, a private room at a quiet restaurant, and emphasized how important reconciliation was to them. Emily was hesitant, but Daniel believed closure was necessary. I agreed, because I knew avoidance would only allow them to rewrite the narrative in their favor. Asterisk, when we arrived, they were already seated, composed and polite, wearing the calm expressions of people who believed they were still in control. The conversation began gently, almost rehearsed. Apologies were offered, though they were vague and carefully worded, more about intention than accountability. Emily's father spoke about stress and fear of losing his daughter. Emily's mother spoke about tradition and concern. They wanted understanding without consequences. Asterisk. Then Emily surprised everyone. She thanked them for acknowledging tension, but told them clearly that acknowledgement was not the same as change. She said she loved them, but she would no longer accept decisions being made about her life without her consent. Her voice didn't shake this time. Daniel reached for her hand, and in that simple gesture, I saw the future solidify. Asterisk, Emily's parents turned to me, perhaps hoping I would soften the moment. Instead, I did what I had come to do. I told them that before this family moved forward, there was something they needed to understand fully. I spoke calmly, without pride or bitterness, and explained who I had been before I chose a quieter life. I told them about the years I spent in senior management, negotiating contracts, overseeing acquisitions, and making decisions that affected thousands of employees. I told them about stepping away after my husband's death, not because I failed, but because I chose peace over prestige. I didn't mention numbers. I didn't need to. Experience carries its own weight. Their reactions were immediate and unmistakable. Emily's mother's composure cracked first, her eyes widening as realization settled in. Emily's father tried to recover, asking careful questions now, respectful ones, the kind you should have asked from the beginning. Daniel sat silently, absorbing the truth not with resentment, but with awe. He finally understood that my simplicity had always been a choice, not a limitation. I finished by saying that none of this mattered unless it changed how we treated one another. I told them that respect should never be based on status, and that love should never be conditional. I made it clear that their involvement in Daniel and Emily's life was welcome only if it came without control, manipulation, or quiet superiority. For the first time, they listened without interrupting. The weeks that followed were different. Not perfect, but honest. Emily's parents stepped back, learning how to participate without directing. Boundaries were respected. Conversations became clearer. Daniel grew into his role as a partner rather than a son caught between loyalties. And Emily found a confidence that had been waiting patiently beneath years of expectation. On the day of the wedding, I watched my son stand beside the woman he loved, steady and certain. Emily's parents greeted me not with polite tolerance, but with genuine respect. It wasn't victory that filled me then. It was relief. Relief that truth, when handled with patience and courage, had done what force never could. People often mistake quiet for weakness and humility for ignorance. They assume that those who don't announce their strength don't possess it. But the most powerful people in the room are often the ones who wait, observe, and choose their moment carefully. I never needed them to know who I was. I only needed them to understand that love, when underestimated, can still stand its ground. And it always will.